This is the data privacy detective. Well, when clouds gather, we get ready for storms. Sometimes they're hurricanes, sometimes tornadoes, who knows? But in a data world, let's face it, it's increasingly multi-cloud. So how do we protect our data that's ever more susceptible to attack by malactors? And today we're going to talk about identity orchestration and identity and access management. And we couldn't have a better guest than the author of Identity Orchestration for Dummies, Eric Olden. Eric, thank you for joining us today.
I appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
Now, Eric, you're the CEO of Strata.io, IO standing for Identity Orchestration. And we're going to talk about IAM and why it's essential these days that we build privacy by design into the data system that any organization uses for its data, and in part to defeat cybercrime and, of course, to make it easy to have customers and vendors, and so everything works well. So let me start with this question, Eric. What is identity orchestration?
It's a great question. It is a new category of identity software that came about because of the move to multi-cloud and hybrid. And if you think about the new challenges that happen when you're running your applications on different clouds and often using different identity providers, now we need to figure out how you can make things work together instead of putting everything in one basket. So when I talk about identity provider, I'm talking about the identity, user identity, and ways to manage authentication. Who are they? Users, are they who they say they are? Access control, can they get to the applications they're trying to? Authorization, can they perform the functions and so forth? And all of the different identity services that we use day to day that usually come from identity systems like Microsoft's Entra ID or Okta or Auth0, or the legacy systems like Ping or Oracle or SiteMinder. Well, there's all sorts of these new systems and new ways to bring them together that required a new way to think about orchestrating identity across these different systems. And that's really where it came from.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about the identity largely of organizations. We all may have a personal identity, but take Amazon. I mean, they came up with one click. Boy, didn't that work out well for them. But a lot goes on without our knowing. Go to Amazon or you go to your bank, and now we're familiar. Well, we get they use MFA, right? And then or we have passwords, and then another. But you're talking about a world where we've moved far beyond that. We want to be able to deal simply with an organization, but not have the risk that our data, that our money's going to get hijacked. That's what you're dealing with, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And it shows up in a lot of different ways. For instance, you think about if you're a financial institution and you want to sign up new customers on your website. Well, it's different in the virtual world because unlike if someone walked into a branch or your bank in the real world, you could get their driver's license and look at the person, does it match up with the driver's license? Well, what do you do when that's all virtualized?
Yeah,
and so being able to link up technology that will do identity proofing along with creating a user account in an identity database, that's an example of some of the new kinds of ways that organizations are trying to figure out how to, translate the trusted world into the virtual world. And identity orchestration is a way to have a multi-step process that's really easy to use for the end user, but would, in this example, make it easy for the bank to show that they are verifying that it's a real person and not a robot.
And really has an account at the bank, and so payment could be made. Well, what does Strata.io do for organizations?
Well, we are in the business of solving the three big problems. The first is so many organizations are trying to modernize their identity infrastructure to use modern cloud-based technology, and we help them avoid rewriting all of their applications to use something new. And that's something that can save a huge amount of time and millions of dollars. The second thing that we do is help our customers avoid costly downtime, because it is only a matter of how often that an identity provider goes down. Even the biggest organizations still have outages for lots of different reasons. And with identity orchestration, you can fail over from one identity system to the other.
I've heard that can be, for some there's $1 million a minute of downtime.
That's right. It's shocking, and it's often even more than just the dollars in time, but can have a real impact on people, because the applications that we're talking about are mission critical. And
Right.
if you think about, in healthcare, if you don't have access to the systems that support maybe an operation or getting the right medicine to the right patient, that could be a life and death issue.
Or think of the military. I mean, goodness, you can't go to war. Well, maybe the pacifists could like that. I don't know. And what's the third thing that you're really addressing?
Yeah, the third thing is compliance. And a lot of regulations today are addressing the fact that so many vulnerabilities and compromises are happening because of reliance on passwords. And so whether it's an insurance requirement or a government mandate, there are a lot of reasons why you need to stop using passwords and instead use something like multi-factor authentication, or MFA, often called passwordless.
Right,
So,
but you don't want to do that 6 or 7 times when you're, as a consumer. You want to do it once and then have it stick. That's what you're dealing with.
yeah, that's exactly right. And so from an organization standpoint, if you had to rewrite all of your applications to use a new technology, that becomes really difficult. And so what we do is we bridge the legacy old applications, 5 years old even, where they were built before standards, and we can make those work with a standards-based authentication system that's from a modern technology without changing the application. So ultimately, it means that the customers are better protected from a privacy standpoint, but also organizations can show that they're compliant with the regulations.
Right, and compliance is always seems to be best practices, and they keep evolving. Well, we've talked about IO. Everybody knows what that means. And IAM, now that's identity and access management. I mean, what are the challenges in that you face?
Well, the challenge with identity and access management is really about complexity and scale. And when I talk about complexity, what I'm getting at is there could be multiple ways and systems that a user can be authenticated with. And that could be different technologies. And it happens often because of mergers and acquisitions. It's one of the most common reasons why an organization would have, an identity system from Okta for some users and an identity system from Microsoft for others. And so in that case, we need to make identity work from different technologies, but do it in the same way. And that becomes a real great use case for orchestrating between two different systems. The other big point around identity orchestration is around modernization. And that we see all the time, where we need to make something old work with something new, and we don't have the time to repurchase everything. And so you really need to find a way to make things work almost backwards compatible. And that's a big part of identity orchestration that you'll see. But more broadly, we think about identity and access management as the 7 A's, as I think about it. And the first one, authentication, is the user who they say they are. Second one, access control. Can they get to the resource? The third is authorization. Can they perform a function? Next one is attributes, and those are data about a user, like their job level or their status as an employee or a contractor. Administration and governance, which is really how you manage the life cycle of all these identities, and audit and reporting being the sixth. And the seventh has become, especially in this year of 2024, where the availability is so important, because with these applications, if your identity system goes down, your applications are offline. So really thinking about how to maintain resilience of your identity systems is now part of identity as we define it.
Right. Now, of course, we talk about data, and often it's at rest. It's collected by somebody, and there it sits. But very often it's in flight, and in a multi-cloud or hybrid cloud environment, of course, it's flying all over the place. It's being shared many places. So what are the risks that arise to our data as it's being shared with so many different repositories?
Yeah, well, it's always important to start with an understanding of the data that you have. So classifying and inventorying the kind of data that are in your systems is a great first step. And then you can focus on the sensitive data, especially personally identifiable information, or sensitive security information like credentials and passwords. The second point after that is to map out wherever the data is it encrypted? And that can be while it's sitting in the repository at rest in a database, or as it's moving from the user to the identity system. So encrypting it as it's traveling over the internet. And with today's zero trust technologies, that means not using a VPN like we did years ago, but instead just using the open internet and transport level security. So I think that's a good first step. The next thing with data is, especially in this multinational, multi-cloud world, is to recognize that data has sovereignty issues. Where it resides matters. And even if we're looking at European privacy directives and GDPR, things that originated initially in Europe now are coming to America because there are multinational implications, because even the most basic multinational company is going to have operations in more than one country. And so really understanding the data privacy regulations that you need to adhere to is important, even if you're not based in some of these more stringent locations. Then the last thing I would say from the data standpoint is making sure that all of the access is always logged. And that's important in the event that there's a problem, that you can go back and you can see the custody, like where did the data, where was it accessed, who is accessing it. And that applies to your end users as well as your administrators, to always make sure that we're very clear on what's happening to the data, so you can show a regulator or an auditor, here are the beginning, middle, and the end of how our data is being accessed. And having clarity on that is really critical today.
Well, it sure is. And we're seeing a rise, of course, of data provenance, and essential for any valid use of AI, for example. And where did the information start and how did it get there and so on. Well, how can organizations ensure identity continuity and resilience?
Yeah, it's become a really big issue. A number of high visibility outages have got people thinking, I don't want to be the next one in the headlines. And I think the first way to start is to identify any single points of failure in your environment. And especially when it comes from an identity standpoint, really understanding if you're single threaded anywhere. And a good start is to inventory the applications and the data behind those applications, as well as your user community, to make sure that you understand where your risk is. Is it a mission critical application that you can't afford to go down even for a few minutes? Or is it an important application but one that if it was down for a couple hours wouldn't be the end of the world. And that's important because at scale, you really want to start where the problems are and then eventually move and protect everything. But instead of starting at less important things, start at the really important ones.
Right.
And that's about compliance and analyzing the risk. The second thing to do is when you're looking at your environment and your architecture, how will you avoid that single point of failure? So where are the dependencies? And the thing that we look for is air gaps, so that you don't have a connection between two systems, so that if one system goes down, it brings the second one down. And an air gap means that they're related but disconnected, and they can work in an intermittent way. So now that you've got your data organized and architecture defined, now we need to figure out how to monitor and detect a problem in an identity system before it spirals out of control. And that's where you want to monitor the health of your identity systems. And once you now know where your identity systems are and if they're having an outage, then you can do the next step, which is failover. And this means,
and that's not just for your particular IT system, but it's cloud to cloud failover, right?
That's right. That's right. So imagine if vendor A goes down, how do you fail over to vendor B?
Yeah.
And it's really more of a cloud to cloud. And we're talking about the identity providers in particular. So yeah, absolutely being able to fail over if one cloud system goes down, go to another. But there's a big problem when the connection to the cloud or the internet goes down. And so you want to be able to fail over from the cloud back to on premises. And that means that you can have a kind of a backup plan in case the cloud goes down, you can still keep the business running. And the last two things that I would, suggest would be test but verify. And that's a play on words from the old trust but verify back in the 80s. But instead of nuclear proliferation, we're talking about confidence in your failover. So when you've got your system set up, make sure that they work and that you're going to have the outcome that you expect, and then be able to provide a report after action. So when something goes wrong, we always want to avoid repeating that mistake. And so having the forensic kind of flight recorder, if you will, that will show you these are what led up to the problem. Here's the problem. Here's how we resolved it. And this is how we restored core functionality. Being able to show all of that to the people who are making the architectural decisions and operational decisions is really important.
Yeah, and we're seeing is around some countries 72-hour deadline for reporting an incident. This would help them do that. Well, the costs, as we've already talked about, it can be just astronomical for downtime and so on. What about the cost to the privacy of individuals? Organizations hold huge amounts of very sensitive personal information about people. What about the cost to the privacy of people?
Yeah, I'd say huge consideration, because I think there's doing the right thing, and then there's making sure that you've got your bases covered. So what I mean by that is do the right thing. Make sure that you're really clear with your users about the information that you collect. And when in doubt, don't collect it, right? I think there's a kind of a expectation that someone's going to tell you what data they're going to collect about you. And so the least amount of data that you can to deliver the service that you can is better, because it'll reduce the blast radius in the event of a breach. Another big driver of that is around just confidence in the system. Imagine if your bank was breached and you get a notification that your credentials were compromised and stolen, presumably. Well, that's going to make a lot of people nervous to work with that bank, because don't we expect that is one of the core things that a bank can do is keep things safe. So I think reputational considerations are significant, because the last thing any insurance company or health provider or anyone else dealing with sensitive privacy data wants is to be in the headline. And so I think really thinking about your reputation and the risks around that and being proactive, not reactive, is an important way to stay ahead of that risk.
Essential for any organization who wants to be viewed as privacy-centric for its users. Well, rounding third and heading to home here, I use a baseball term, what are your top 2 or 3 tips for individuals about safeguarding their personal information in this multi-cloud data world?
Well, I've got 3 that come to mind. 2 are pretty obvious. The third might be a bit controversial, but the first 2 is always opt for multi-factor authentication.
MFA, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And if your bank or whoever isn't offering it, ask for it, because a lot of these are product decisions that these organizations are trying to prioritize. And so if they see that people care about having better account security, then they're going to make the investment. The second thing is, if you're using passwords and there's no alternative, then use a password vault, which is like a password manager. 1Password is a good example. There's a bunch. BitLocker, Bitwarden. There's a number of different ones, and probably the most helpful thing and the browsers have these in built in as well. But the most important thing is to not reuse a password in multiple websites, because it's very common for people to reuse passwords. And if I'm a bad actor, I'm not going to try and break into the high security, really sophisticated vault that has all the protections. If I can get that same information by going after another organization that has less security, maybe it's a smaller company or whatever, but if I have the same password, whatever, banana, it's not my password, but get the idea. If I use that banana password in every place I go, if someone breaches the low security system, then they know they got banana. They can go try that in the high security one.
Right.
And guess what? They're going to get in. So avoiding reuse of passwords is hard, because you end up writing it down, and that's not secure. So a password manager can be really helpful if you have to use a password at all. And then the last thing as a tip is maybe controversial, because social media is a place that people put a lot of privacy information, and they think, oh, it's just sharing pictures, or I'm just talking with my friend about one thing or the other, and just talking about a trip that I'm going on. Well, amongst trusted people, that's not a problem. It's the people who are the bad actors that are trying to figure out where they can get data that they can use to compromise your accounts. And I've seen it a number of times. I have 2 kids, one's in college, one's in high school, and the number of times that they are spearphished to try and, I presume, get access to me is kind of surprising. So when you look at social media, just be mindful that you may be sharing information with people that you don't really expect. And so maybe don't say exactly when you're going to go on a trip, so that people don't know to try and emulate a transaction from, a city that they think you're going to be in because you shared that on social media. Right. So just some common sense things that sometimes when you don't have the context of security and a bad actor trying to hack you, you may not think about. But those would be the 3 things: multi-factor, password manager, and be mindful on social media.
Well, Eric, thanks for this great tour of identity orchestration and related things. And as always, dear listeners, I will remind us all, protecting your personal privacy begins with you.